Hello and welcome. I'm George Beebe. I'm Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for the National Interest. Today we're discussing the topic of managing confrontation in US-Russian relations. I think this is a very timely discussion as Secretary of State Tony Blinken and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov will be meeting this Thursday in Iceland. And this will be the first time the two have met directly in person since Mr. Blinken became Secretary of State. And I think it's safe to say that President Biden's proposed summit meeting with Vladimir Putin is certain to be high on their agenda for discussion. The Biden administration is taking a different approach, in my opinion, to dealing with Russia than any of its predecessor administrations in the post-Soviet period. All of those American administrations began their time in office by looking forward to an improved and more cooperative relationship with Russia. And this was true from Bill Clinton right through to Donald Trump. President Biden, on the other hand, has not called for a reset. He's avoided that term, and he's not called for a partnership or much improved relations with Russia. In fact, he's made clear that the United States will hold Russia to account when Russian behavior transgresses norms and rules that the United States believes are important. He's called for making the relationship more stable and predictable, but he's not looked forward to partnership or very much cooperation except on a narrow set of issues that the United States believes is in its interest. Now, the Russians have looked at this and said, this appears to be schizophrenic. It's a combination of narrow areas of cooperation and very clear areas of confrontation. And many of them have called this American schizophrenia. On the other hand, a lot of American commentators have looked at this and said that this is a necessary correction in the way we're dealing with Russia. And they call it an effort to walk and chew gum at the same time that can, in their view, make the US-Russian relationship more stable and predictable. So what we want to talk about today is whether Biden's approach can succeed where other US approaches to Russia have failed. And to look at in some detail what factors are critical for success and what variables might lead to failure in this approach. And we have a very impressive set of panelists today, and I'll introduce them briefly. Robert Legvold is the Marshall D. Shulman Professor Emeritus at Columbia University, and someone I would call probably the dean of America's experts on Russia. Dmitry Suslov is the Deputy Director of the Center for Comprehensive European and International Studies and a Senior Lecturer at the National Research University Higher School of Economics in Russia. And Marlene Laruelle is Research Professor of International Affairs and Director of the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the George Washington University. She is also the author of a very impressive new book called Is Russia Fascist? Unraveling Propaganda East and West. So without further ado, I would like to ask each of our panelists today to begin with a short opening set of remarks. And once they are done, we're going to turn to the audience for questions to our panelists. So Bob, could you begin?
Thank you, George. It's a pleasure to be with you, a pleasure to be with Marlene and Dmitry. I must say for the first time in some time, I'm guardedly optimistic, very guardedly optimistic about prospects at this point. I think the basis for that is I think both sides at this point are interested in trying to reach, in the phrase that you used from the Biden administration, a more stable and a predictable relationship, or a relationship that's on a more stable and predictable basis. And I base that limited or guarded optimism on the small but significant steps that I think have been taken in that direction. The first of those that I would cite is in the recent tat for tat retaliations that we've had in the Biden administration and then Moscow's response, the stress on both sides on restraint. That is, each saying we could have done more, but we didn't want to escalate the existing tensions or contribute to a further deterioration in the relationship. And then secondly, of course, the relaunching prospect of arms control, the agreement to extend New START, and then the prospects of renewed negotiations, the progress that appears to be being made on the JCPOA and salvaging it or saving it, and even more recently, signs on the part of the Biden administration they're prepared to revisit the Open Skies Treaty that the Trump administration abandoned. And I would expect the June summit, while not producing any kind of significant breakthrough, to be a continuation of what I call these small but significant steps forward. And that will be the criterion by which I measure the success of it. Having said that, I think there's also the problem of what I call a very strong headwind that will pose an obstacle to any substantial progress. It consists of at least 4 different things. First of all, the deep skepticism on the part of leadership and elites in both sides about the prospects of moving forward. Secondly, the damage that can be done at any time by the untoward event. Look at the impact of the emergence of the story around Navalny more recently. Third, the dominant negative synergies over positive synergies at every level of the interaction between the two countries. And fourth, the distortions produced by the warped stories that each side is telling about the other. And by stories, I mean the inaccurate explanations for the behavior of the other side that underpin policy. And I attribute that or ascribe that to both sides. A further point, as you said, no one expects a new reset, and indeed the Biden administration has made plain they don't seek it. And instead, I believe the new reality that we have at this point is what I would call dueling two-track policies on the part of both sides. Two-track policy that is to counter the misdeeds and misbehavior of the other side, but to cooperate where one can, where it's in national interest. In the US case, the phrasing for that is now well known. Hold Russia to account on the one hand, but on the other hand, cooperate where possible. It's interesting, by the way, in terms of that counter and cooperate, the formula is parallel with China's somewhat different. It is threefold. It is to counter, it is to compete, and it is to cooperate. In the case of Russia, the counter and cooperate is rebuff United States actions, including sanctions and other actions to which the Russians object, but also to seek cooperation where possible. The problem, however, is that the two tracks are not balanced, and the stress and the effort is very much on the first track, the countering, holding to account, or rebuffing behavior. And the second problem is cooperate, yes, but cooperate basically on our terms. The task, therefore, in my view, is to rebalance the two tracks where there is an equal attention to both the countering and the cooperation. And secondly, the task is to mitigate the negative synergies from that first track of countering on the second, the prospects of reaching accommodation or cooperation. And then to look for the potential positive synergies from the second track on the first. Do all of this quite consciously. I think as a result of all of this, in terms of my anticipation, I think the most that one can expect at this point is limited and impacted progress at best. Real progress would depend on something much more ambitious and much more substantial. It would, first of all, require a recognition of what the stakes are or should have been recognized as the stakes in the relationship, managing an increasingly complex and dangerous multipolar nuclear world that we're actually losing control over. Peace in Europe, and look at where we are from what the hopes were at the end of the Cold War when we spoke of a Euro-Atlantic security community from Vancouver to Vladivostok. But where are we today, and where might we go if we don't attend to what is this large stake? Avoiding a wholesale US, China, Russia Cold War, the existential threat from climate change. And in order to make real progress, I think there is a need that neither government and in fact, the elites in neither side have really attended to, and that is integrating what I would call integrating short-term policy imperatives with longer-term objectives. The shorter-term policy imperatives of dealing with Ukraine, of Syria, with questions of domestic and electoral interference and the like, with the longer-term objectives realistically framed that the flow from the stakes that I've just outlined. And I finish by saying that real progress, as opposed to limited and impacted progress, I think is out of reach.
Thank you, Bob. I think you've gotten us off to an impressive start. There's much to discuss in what you've raised. I'd like to remind the audience that you may submit questions in written form through the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screens. Let me turn it now to Dmitry Suslov. Dmitry, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, George, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. Let me start by agreeing with Bob Legvold that already now there are certain, I would say, cautious but still definite signs and preconditions for some stabilization of the US-Russian relations. Not improvement, which is very unlikely in the near-term prospect, but at least stabilization. And there are several reasons for me to make this conclusion. First, we have already de-escalated the first serious crisis of US-Russian relations during Biden's presidency, namely escalation in and around Ukraine and concentration of the Russian troops near Ukrainian border. The US-Russian dialogue, including the Biden-Putin phone conversation, was a very important channel of this de-escalation. Not the only one, but among several, a very important channel. Second, neither side wants further escalation. I fully agree with this, and this is manifest not just in words, but also in real steps that we both make. For instance, the United States refused to accuse the Russian government in cyber attack against the Colonial Pipeline, and Russia produced an extremely short, surprisingly short list of unfriendly countries, and even postponed implementation of the decision which prohibits the US embassy to hire non-US citizens. Third, both sides express an interest to stabilize relations and to cooperate where we do have shared interests and where this cooperation is simply vital for our security and development. And this includes, at minimum, strategic stability beyond the New START, and including cybersecurity, climate change and its consequences, specifically and especially in the Arctic, and of course the pandemic. And fourth, preparation for the Putin-Biden summit is unfolded. It is going on. Despite Russia has not given the official answer yet, the meeting is being prepared. Of course, the situation in the relations is very fragile and the new rounds of escalation are possible. However, these new rounds would be undesirable. And it is very important that both sides consider possible future rounds of escalation as undesirable. There is an understanding in Moscow that containing Russia is an important but not the top priority of the Biden administration, which considers struggle with China, domestic problems, and COVID much more important than much more important tasks. And thus, Biden administration requires stabilization with Russia just to be able to concentrate on these more important priorities. Also, Russia does not see any serious readiness of the Biden administration to allocate serious material resources in containing and especially rolling Russia back in the former Soviet Union, including Ukraine. Rhetorical diplomatic containment, yes, but not something that could draw the United States into an open military conflict with Russia. And this is also a very important factor in favor of stabilization, because of course, Biden administration is interested in avoiding a crisis in which it is not ready to fight, but which would be extremely costly for the United States politically in terms of prestige, credibility, and so on. And Russia, on its own part, in Russia also there is no interest in further escalation with the United States, because further escalation brings more costs than benefits. It prevents to resolve problems, in resolution of which Russia is very interested. Also, the bumpy start of the US-Russian relations under Biden was not a surprise. It was inevitable, provided Biden's election rhetoric, the promises given late last year to punish Russia for certain things, given polarization of the US political system, as well as given some features of the Democrats' foreign policy approach. Of course, very few here in Moscow expected the killer statement, but a more robust ideological rhetoric and greater pressure on Russian domestic affairs were absolutely inevitable and expected. It was also obvious from the very beginning that Biden administration would try to make compartmentalization as an inherent and perhaps the central feature of US-Russian relations for the next several years. It became finally clear when Biden combined quite harsh criticism of Russian domestic and foreign behavior with prompt extension of the New START. So in terms of balance between rhetoric and political atmosphere of the relations on the one hand, and the real agenda of practical cooperation and the ability to produce tangible results on the other hand, the US-Russian relations today seem a mirror opposition to what was under Donald Trump. Under Donald Trump, a relatively positive rhetoric coming from President Trump himself coincided with zero chances to move anywhere. American domestic struggle against Trump, the use of Russia factor as the major instrument against Trump, prevented any constructive interaction. And by 2020, the US-Russian practical agenda almost disappeared. Today, on the contrary, there is harsh rhetoric towards Putin in particular, but there is a chance for real agenda and the readiness to cooperate selectively on a number of issues on which the sides have common interests. Again, namely strategic stability beyond START, cybersecurity, non-proliferation, climate change, Arctic, and the pandemic. And that is quite a rich agenda. Such a bifurcated model of relations, of course, is unstable. And the confrontational dimension will be providing a negative impact on the selective cooperation dimension. It is certainly not what Russia would want ideally, right? Ideally, Russia would want a general improvement of the relations, and George Beebe is absolutely right in the Russian characterization of this model as schizophrenic. But still, this model is practical and achievable. It is possible. And it is better than just confrontation. And this model is already in the making. You know, we have to keep in mind, of course, that the general nature of US-Russian relations is confrontation. And maximum what is possible in the near-term prospect is keeping this confrontation manageable. So how should we keep this confrontation manageable? First and foremost, we need to understand the red lines of each other. Restraint in terms of crossing the red lines, first. Secondly, selective cooperation on areas of shared interests. And third, while preserving adversarial attitude towards each other in general and confrontational policies in many regions and domains, they seem to be the combination of these three components. They seem to be the three pillars of the manageable confrontation, of the model of US-Russian relations for the next several years. So let me say it very clearly, conduct of selective cooperation does not require rejection of confrontation in general. Rejection of confrontation in general is simply impossible, and we should not have any illusions about that. But it does require respect of red lines. If the red lines are crossed, then of course selective cooperation becomes impossible and the overall confrontation becomes unmanageable. What are the Russian red lines? I think that reading and monitoring Russian behavior provides an answer. To name just a few. Apparent support of the Russian political opposition, that would be a red line. Attempts to integrate Ukraine into NATO or to establish a permanent military presence on its territory, clearly a red line. Official rejection of the Minsk agreements by Ukraine, and rejection of the current format of the Donbas conflict resolution, clearly a red line. Support of regime change in Belarus followed by its foreign policy reorientation, clearly red line, right? Which would also jeopardize this manageable confrontation. But if we avoid, I mean, we should have a clear understanding of those red lines on both sides. Of course, the United States also should identify those red lines. And if we respect them, then I think we can quite successfully combine the general confrontational model of relations with selective cooperation, where this selective cooperation is necessary. And let me finish with the following. This selective cooperation should not be considered as a tool to improve relations whatsoever. Again, in the observable future, the general improvement of relations is impossible, but this selective cooperation is a must because we drastically need it because of our security concerns, because of our vital national interests, and so on and so forth. And I think that's if we try to manage this three-pod system, it would be quite a stable model for at least next 3-4 years.
Thank you very much, Dmitry. Marlene, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, George. Thank you for the invitation. I have one follow-up on what Bob and Dmitry said, and then two main points. My first kind of follow-up is to agree with them and say that I think Russia is very much at ease with this kind of compartmentalization of the relationship. Russia needs predictability, not improvement. And I think also on the Russian side, the Russian elites understood that for the US, it's China that will be more critical than Russia. And I think Russia is also on its own side trying to be less obsessed with the US and to learn to live without being entirely focused on the relationship with the US. And I'm mentioning that because I will come back on that very soon. And in terms of kind of finding selective cooperation area, I think the chairmanship of the Arctic Council by Russia that is beginning, it could be really a great kind of territory of implementation of this selective cooperation, because that's a place, the Arctic, where Russia feels much more secure in its dominance and the US is in a much less great power position for several reasons. So I think that's where you could imagine this selective cooperation being kind of tested, and then there are of course other domains that would be could be developed. Now 2 points. The first one is indirectly related to the sanction and to the fact that I think the US tend to think too much of Russia being in a deadlock between having either to align with the West or to side with China. And that's usually the narrative we have on the US side, that the more we are pushing Russia outside, the more Russia will have to side with China. I think it's much more complicating than that, and that Russia is looking for a diversification that would be outside the West, but also outside the China relationship. And so we could totally imagine Russia being able to cooperate with many second-tier countries in the world and not only with the two bigs, right? So I think there is on the US side also an obsession with great power. So we tend to think only about the triangle of US, Russia, China. I think Russia has a much better perception of the way it can use both geopolitically and economically kind of second-tier countries. And I think there is a real strategy on the Russian side to try to react on the sanction, not by turning toward China, but by trying to develop a lot of different partnerships that we tend usually to kind of overlooked. My second point, and it will go back to what Dmitry said about one of the red lines for Russia, is the domestic opposition and the support to domestic opposition. And that's all about the Navalny story. I think it's important for us to think of Russia, not only Russia after Putin, but Russia under Putin, right? Russians without Putin, and to realize that the Russian society is changing. Currently, we have grassroots activism in very urban municipal politics. We have a lot of Russians becoming active in kind of volunteering associations, signing petitions, the number of Russians appealing to the authorities and using all the tools that the Russian government at the different level put in, trying to kind of get feedback from the society on what doesn't work to try to prevent dissatisfaction. Russians are using all these tools. And I think the problem with Navalny, and of course, I mean, it's important to follow what is happening to Navalny, and we don't want him to die in prison. But Navalny is the tree hiding the forest, or obscuring what is happening in Russia. And I think that's important to realize that you have a revolutionary opposition in Russia, but you also have a kind of evolutionary movement. You have people who are active politically, who don't want the system to be overthrown or to collapse. They want the system to change from the inside. And I think that's our obsession with Navalny make us only look at this kind of revolutionary opposition that would overthrow the system. And we are missing all the signals sent by several layers of the Russian societies telling us that change is on its way. And of course, there are growing repression from the Russian government side around the Navalny and so on, because as Dmitry was saying, it's a kind of red line. But I think it's important for us to understand that Navalny doesn't have a huge support, while the Russian society is largely unhappy with the way the government is managing kind of everyday life, social, economic expectation. You have a growing number of Russians who are ready, who are in a kind of protest mood, even if they are not ready to go in the street. You have a number of people who have a lot of quite conservative values, but who still want the regime to adapt, right? And I think that's our kind of obsession with Navalny is also sending the wrong signals to the Russian societies, because that's not creating line or channel of discussion with all those who are at the more evolutionary change. And I know evolutionary change can be kind of, it takes time, it's never entirely satisfying, it will not be the kind of the revolutionary change some may hope, but that's the reality for Russia, to hope for evolutionary slow transformation and not for any kind of radical change. And so just to say that, and to conclude on that, to say that the fact that, for example, we are suspending visa service for average Russian citizen by a US embassy, I mean, we are also killing our own soft power and our own channel of communication in the people-to-people relationship. And I think it would be really important for the US to try to invent a new way to realize that these changes are there in the Russian societies under the Putin's regime and outside of the Navalny case, and try to give some room and therefore some time also for all these changes to arrive. But so I have a much more kind of optimistic, even if it's contrasted, I think that you also have a higher level of repression now that you had a few months or a few years ago, but the society is changing. And I think we should put that somewhere in the picture. And what I see from the Biden administration, I mean, I like the way Bob framed it, the kind of countering the cooperating track. I think if we want the cooperating track to be really important and not only have the countering one, we need to find channel of communication with the large part of the Russian society that is totally outside the kind of Putin versus Navalny dichotomy. And I will just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlene. I would like to start off the questions by following up on Dmitry's point about red lines. Inherent in that concept of red lines is the notion that there are some things that can't be compartmentalized, some things that we can't simply agree to disagree on and not let them spoil the larger relationship. That's what a red line is, an area that is unacceptable to be crossed. Dmitry, you started to talk a little bit about where you thought Russia's red lines were. And I have two questions on this. One, do you believe the United States understands where those red lines are? And number two, do you think that the United States has red lines, and does Russia understand where those are drawn? So I'll start with Dmitry, but I'd like to open it up to the rest of the panel too.
Well, I think that, well, first, Putin deliberately made the emphasis on the red lines in his address to the Federal Assembly, and he put it really as a precondition for stabilization of relations with the United States and moving forward with this compartmentalization or bifurcated nature of US-Russian relations. He was not specific in his public statements, and the Russian Foreign Ministry, it was also not specific in their public statements about the definitions of those red lines. But again, if we analyze the Russian foreign policy over the last several years, actually we can say over the last 3 decades, then we would get the answer on this. I think that in the United States, there is an understanding of those red lines. The question is whether the United States understand those red lines as legitimate or not, right? And on those issues, I think there is no consensus. And the mainstream in the United States claims that those demands on the Russian side exist, but they are fully illegitimate. And thus, the United States should probably ignore them in the course of development of its relations with Russia. And Russia showed very well, I think. Again, let me mention the recent escalation around Ukraine, that this will not work, right? And that would Russia not hesitate to use even military force in order to defend those red lines. And actually, I think this Ukrainian crisis, I mean, the escalation, the recent escalation and then de-escalation of Ukrainian crisis was quite helpful. I'm sorry for being that cynical, but I think it was helpful for US-Russian relations now under Biden administration, right? First, because we managed de-escalation, and secondly, the chance that Russian red lines would be taken seriously became higher. On American red lines, certainly they are. And I think the United States also showed very clearly over the last several years what those red lines are. Interference into American elections, right? With some tacit support of one of the candidates and so on and so forth is something that is viewed by the United States as a red line. And look, the Russian behavior in 2020 election or vis-a-vis 2020 election in the United States was way different from what the United States alleged Russian behavior was in 2016, right? So I mean, that was a clear indication that there is a learning process in Russia, and the behavior was corrected. The problem is cybersecurity in general, because there is no consensus on what the red lines are and whether and what are we talking about here, right? For instance, there was a general assumption in Russia, and it continues to be, that cyber operations for the sake of espionage is something which is permissible. It's something that we normally do, and of course it's unpleasant, but that's not terribly, destabilizing. But the SolarWind case, to tell the truth, Russia was surprised with the American reaction to the SolarWind case, because the United States presented it as a crossing of the red line. Why? Okay, if you consider cyber operations for the purpose of espionage as crossing of the red lines, then let's discuss it. Let's have a serious conversation then on cybersecurity and figure out whether these red lines are. From the Russian perspective, cyber operation with the purpose of disruption, with the purpose of inflicting damage, is the red line, is crossing the red lines, whereas espionage is not. So, I mean, the situation is blurred, right? And we need dialogue. We need dialogue in order to have a clear understanding of those red lines. And I hope that the aftermath of Biden-Putin summit will launch, that there will be a serious US-Russian dialogue, which could be generally framed as strategic stability dialogue. And within this dialogue, it will not be just about the strategic nuclear weapons. It will be, Russia wants it to be much broader. And within this broader dialogue, we could have a clear understanding on the red lines of both sides.
Other comments?
Well, just if I can add one sentence to follow up on what Dmitry said about the US probably thinking that Russia's red line on Ukraine and potentially on Belarus are politically legitimate. I think the second question for the US to ask is that even if they consider it's politically legitimate, are they ready to have them crossed? Because the cost of crossing them is of course different on both sides. I think the Russian side is ready to have some of its people dying for Ukraine and Belarus. The US side is not, right? And I think we should be very clear on these two key red lines that we have in Europe, is that the US side is not ready to pay a high price, whereas Russia is ready to pay a high price. And that should be a key element of the kind of strategic discussion or reflection on the US side, even if they consider that politically it's illegitimate, while concretely no one here in the US is ready to die for Ukraine and Belarus. And I think it should be said also very clearly.
George, a very brief comment. I agree with much of what both Marlene and Dmitry have just said, but I would interject another proposition, and that is the whole issue of red lines is not helpful. Red lines lead to misinterpretation unless they are clearly articulated. And in the Послание, with the exception of Ukrainian attack on Donbass or military action, where I think it was fairly clear that that is a red line, the Russians would react and react with military force. For the most part, I'm not sure that President Putin has clearly in mind what the red lines are other than to establish them. We all know that in the large macro sense, Ukraine moving into NATO or Georgia moving into NATO or Belarus suddenly moving in a completely different direction toward the West would be a fundamental strategic problem for Russia. And we've seen that all along the line. But on the other issues, that the other three issues or four issues or two issues that Dmitry raised, I'm not sure what that represents in terms of a red line. I'm not sure what crossing it would produce in terms of a reaction, other than to say that it would scuttle whatever progress was being made toward cooperation on other areas. There would be various retaliatory measures taken, whatever within the realm of what we're doing right now. But I do agree with the fundamental point, which I think is a key point. These are issues we need to be talking about in a direct dialogue, in strategic dialogue. I think that is the central issue. And if we have what both sides, based on the second presidential conversation, said was a commitment to strategic stability dialogue, it ought to be a broad-based strategic stability dialogue. It ought not to just be about strategic nuclear arms control.
Okay, we have several questions in from the audience here. I'm going to start with one from Catherine Stoner. She asks, isn't it true that the United States has lost considerable leverage over Russia in the last 4 to 6 years as Trump pursued America first and Russia was relatively free to look around the world for new markets, to evade sanctions, to spread its influence through the Middle East, to militarize the Arctic, to build closer ties to America's other competitor, China? Reactions?
Let me maybe very briefly say that indeed the leverage that the United States has vis-a-vis Russia has rapidly declined, but that's not because of Trump's policies. This is because of the general power shift in the world. This is about the change of the US place in the international system, which might be accelerated by Trump, yes. Right, but this is because of more structural changes in the international system. Russia no longer regards the world as the West dominated, and the Russian foreign policy in general is becoming less West-centric. Russian policy towards China, towards the Middle East, are no longer dependent on the Russia-West relations. For instance, Russia is not going to exchange, let's say, Syria for Ukraine or whatsoever. So yes, the Trump policies could have accelerated this trend. This trend has also been accelerated by the US-Russian confrontation, which has started before Trump. And also a very important factor which contributed to the diminishing of the US leverage vis-a-vis Russia is the institutionalization of sanctions in the United States. The adoption of CAATSA was the Countering American Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, became a certain turning point, because as soon as Russia came to conclusion that now the US sanctions are forever, right? And I mean, it is not in the position, or it is not in the authority even of the US administration to alter those changes, to reduce those changes, then what is indeed the US leverage vis-a-vis Russia?
George,
go ahead, Bob.
I think Catherine's absolutely right, and in the content of her question of suggesting the specific ways in which, or reasons why, U.S.'s leverage is diminished. And Dmitry's response, I think, is absolutely accurate in terms of why that leverage has diminished. But there's another, I'm not sure it's a larger point. There's another point to be made, and that is that out of this deteriorated Russia relationship with the US and with the West generally, Russia has lost something that it needs, and I think genuinely wants, and that is a Western option. And I think Russia, I'm sure that Russia knows, I'm told continually by Russians and by Europeans, that Moscow understands that the key to a Western option for Russia is the United States. It's not Europe itself. Many in Europe feel that Russia believes that Europe doesn't have major agency in the Russia-West relationship. So the United States remains very important in whether or not Russia can reestablish a Western option.
May I just, I fully agree with Bob in that the United States is important and that the Western option is requireable, is necessary for Russia. Russia wants to be a balanced, if Russia wants to preserve itself as one of the poles of power in the world, it has to have balanced relationships with the other key players. And of course, the United States remains a superpower, and Russia basically faces the United States everywhere. But the problem with this Western option is that because of the nature of the US-Russian relations now, the price for that Western option is considered to be in Russia nowadays too far and maybe equal to the collapse of the country. And Russia is not ready to pay this price. Russia is not even ready to pay the price like decline of its relations with China in favor of this Western option. And as soon as this Western option is being discussed, the immediate question in Russia is, can the United States even deliver this option? What the United States can offer to Russia in order to justify this Western option, and what would be the price that Russia would pay for this Western option in exchange for what the United States could provide, right? And so far, the attitude is very pessimistic.
If I can just very, very briefly follow on that, I think Dmitry is really right on the point that from the Russian perspective, what the West can deliver doesn't worth the price that the West is asking for. And I think that's a genuine belief to think that the way power is constructed now in the world means that the US and accessorily, like on the side of Europe, is not worth that they cannot deliver their promises, and that it's better for Russia not even to try to pay that price, because the Russian perspective that the US is in decline in the way it can leverage its power, and it hasn't realized yet, right? So US is still putting the price very high, while Russia consider that in fact the price should be much lower, because in fact US is no more able to deliver what it was promising.
Well, we have a question very much related to this from Paul Hare, who's a distinguished fellow here at the Center for the National Interest. He asked, to what extent does the Russia-China relationship impose limits on any improvement in Russian-US relations? What potential is there for Russian cooperation with the United States independent of China?
Dmitry.
Okay.
I guess.
Well, of course, China is an enormously important factor in Russian relations with the United States, because relations with China, partnership with China provides confidence to Russia. And basically the emergence of China as the second superpower, well, it is both a challenge and opportunity to Russia, but so far it is regarded largely as an opportunity, because it allows Russia really to mitigate the negative consequences of its confrontation with the West. And it also makes Russia to think that it is at the right side of history, right? Unlike the other side, right? That the world in general is developing according to the Russian initial assumptions, right? That the world is becoming multipolar, that there is no longer Western dominance, that there is no longer universalization of the West and the Western values, and so on and so forth. And of course, I mean, Russia is not desperate, well, not largely, but significantly because of China. Russia is not desperate in its when it is in the confrontation with the United States, and the thinking is that we can afford it. We can afford a manageable confrontation. We can't afford a non-manageable confrontation, but manageable confrontation is quite affordable. But the most significant aspect of this is not just Russia has partnership with China, but it is also that China now has confrontation with the United States. And this is what makes Russia, even more confident, because China's confrontation with the United States first distracts the United States towards China. Russia is not the major front of this confrontation. And secondly, the long-term, serious and fundamental confrontation between the United States and China makes Russia quite safe about the prospects of its relations with China. As long as China faces the United States as adversary, China will not afford to instrumentalize the asymmetry against Russia. And Russia will not become a junior partner of China as long as China faces confrontation with the United States.
George, I think what Dmitry said, I think that's quite accurate. But notice one of his points: as long as the US-China confrontation is manageable. What Russia doesn't want is an unmanageable confrontation. And therefore, since the US-China relationship has deteriorated very rapidly and has moved toward what many people now speak about, a potential Cold War between the United States and China, or a strategic rivalry that has very dangerous implications. And a number of specialists on US-China relations have been outlining the way in which it could become very dangerous in that bilateral relationship. That's not in Russia's interest. And therefore, simply to allow the US-China relationship to run free without a constructive Russia approach to it in the US relationship, or indeed by abetting it, by essentially encouraging some of this in various ways, that's not in Russia's interest. And therefore, I think there is a basis as part of a US-Russia strategic stability dialogue on how the two sides want to cooperate, recognizing Russia's stake in the relationship with China. That is not going to diminish. But how do you want to, in this trilateral relationship, introduce strategic stability? Because that cuts across all these other issues. It also involves nuclear weapons. It involves climate change. And this new trilateralism that I would call for requires a constructive element. And I think Russia has a stake in that constructive element.
And if I can add also one point, I think what Dmitry said is really relevant. We tend to always accuse Russia of wanting to be, equal power with the US, but I think we are largely missing the point, is that Russia will be very fine as being number 3 in the triangle. So Russia has much more leverage for its own development and its own strategy. If it is one level below the two others, right? And so I think this accusation of this kind of only Cold War Soviet Union, regaining Soviet Union status and so on, the Russian thinking is much more in tune with the realities, which is it's better to be number 3 than number 2.
Is that number 3 better in a bipolar world or a multipolar world? In other words, does it matter what the fundamental power relationship is?
Yeah, George, brilliant question. Of course, in a multipolar world, and from the Russian perspective, there will be no bipolar world. there will be a very complicated structure of the international system with two superpowers, China and the United States and China. Russia is number 3, then some other great powers following, including regional powers like Turkey or Iran. But despite the existence of these two superpowers who will have gap vis-a-vis all the rest, the world will still be multipolar, not bipolar. Why? First, because China does not and probably will not have its China-centric subsystem of the international system equivalent to what the Soviet Union had in the times of the Cold War. There is no China's bloc in the world, and China even doesn't want such bloc to be created. Secondly, a very strong global tendency is diversification and strive for independence. Too many regional smaller players want to be independent. They want to have agency in international affairs, greater agency in international affairs. Pay attention how often does Erdogan, for instance, and he is a very typical representative of this trend towards independence. He says that the world is not limited by 5, and so on and so forth, right? Meaning the UN Security Council. So there are many countries who don't want to be part of those Cold War-like blocs. This is why the Biden's idea, by the way, of the new global polarization between the world of democracies and world of autocracies, this re-establishment of bloc-to-bloc contradiction on the ideological basis, it will not work. Right, it will not work, and it looks really quite strange from the Russian perspective, and not just from the Russian perspective. Those countries, they don't want to be included in those blocs. They want to be independent, and they don't want to choose either the US or China. And Russia positions itself as a natural partner of those countries who don't want to make such choice.
Well, we're getting close to the end of our session, and I think we have a question from Barry Posen at MIT that I think is a good big picture for understanding the dangers that might exist in confrontation between the United States and Russia. He asks, as far as US policy toward Russia is concerned, things can always get worse. Is there anything worse that you can imagine that the Russian government would care about? Dmitry, why don't we start with you?
Well, first of all, I think that the chances for getting worse less now than they were during the Trump administration. The domestic factors in the United States still allow much broader US-Russian interactions now than it was the case under Trump. During the Trump period, the Congress and establishment wanted to basically kidnap US foreign policy from the hands of the president, right? And the whole issue of Trump being Putin's puppet actually allowed no space for constructive interaction. Today, this factor does not exist, right? This is first thing. Second thing, or a second positive precondition. Biden administration is quite serious about arms control and strategic stability. It does not consider arms race as a preferable foreign policy tool, as a preferable instrument of bargaining. The Trump administration did, right? The Trump administration blackmailed Russia with the prospects of arms race. The Biden administration is not doing that, right? And it seriously approaches strategic stability and arms control. And thirdly, Biden administration takes common challenges seriously, such as climate change, such as terrorism, right? Such as proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. All these together create preconditions for cooperation, right? This is why, as I said in my initial remarks, if there is a further escalation, it would be inadvertent. It would be undesirable, right? Because we do not want that, right? The Biden administration doesn't want that, and Russia doesn't want that. But if it happens that the United States crosses some of the red lines, which I identified before, and this list, of course, could be added, right? For instance, deployment of medium-range missiles in Central and especially Central and Eastern Europe would also be a very dangerous development, and it should be addressed within this strategic dialogue or strategic stability dialogue between Russia and the United States. Then, of course, the relations would deteriorate further.
Other
George,
comments?
a very quick response to Barry's question. Barry would be the first one to imagine ways in which the relationship could deteriorate from where it is now. This guarded optimism that I think all three of us have expressed in terms of this notion of moving toward a more stable and predictable relationship could easily be upended at any one point. And I think we ought to, at this point, fully expect that it won't work and move forward, and the June summit will not have the kind of success one would have, or whatever success will be undone by the next unexpected source of tension, because the unexpected sources of tensions will be there. But if he has in mind something more apocalyptic, then I think it would be something like fundamental instability in Belarus, which both sides are attempting to manage. The Russians are quite clear that fundamental instability in Belarus that suggests a fundamental strategic reorientation of Belarus would be almost, not an existential, certainly an extreme threat from Russia's point of view. And if Russia then acted on that, that would create a compelling imperative for the West to react in some fashion. It's not quite clear how. And we certainly know from history, and Barry would be the first to recognize it, you get into these things by stumbling forward, not by conscious act or pre-planning or otherwise.
Nothing to add.
Okay.
That's a good comment.
I will add one last question here. And I'm going to introduce an ideological component to all of this. When we talked earlier about the Western option that I think you all agreed that Russia wanted to preserve, and the closing down of that option, I think, is one that Russians as well as people in the West are lamenting. Are we talking about a geopolitical option there, or are we talking about something bigger in the nature of what we think of as the West, some liberal idea that is important here? Any thoughts on this?
Well, when I expressed it at the outset, I meant it in a geopolitical sense, but with a very heavy economic and technological component. Russia does not need the West for security purposes. It needs the West in a cooperative relationship for purposes of European security, of which Russia is part. European security is part of that. But the more important thing is something that we've known, it's gone back, it's been emphasized during Medvedev's presidency when he came to the United States, when he made his speeches to the foreign ministry. He said the single major option in this context is the West economically. He didn't list China in that context.
Well, if I may, things changed since Medvedev's presidency in terms of the distribution of power and distribution of technologies in the world. And China is becoming the technological leader #2. It has already become the technological leader #2 in the world. And today, Russia is basically rapidly shifting. This is also problematic because largely Russia now is exchanging its technological dependence on the West to its technological dependence on China. That's a problem. That's a big long-term problem. But the immediately here and now, Russian technological dependence on the West is regarded as a crucial vulnerability and as a serious security threat, which must be addressed. So Russia thus tries to diminish its technological dependence on the West. So what do we mean by the Western option? Geopolitics, just as a global partner. Russia needs the West as a global partner in order to promote many of its interests. For the sake of balance of Russian foreign policy, in order to get too much into dependence vis-a-vis some other countries like China. Russia is already balancing vis-a-vis China. It does so with India, with Southeast Asian countries, and so on and so forth. It promotes BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and Russia basically insisted in including India into Shanghai Cooperation Organization precisely to balance China. So ideally, we would want cooperative relations with the West, also positive relations with the West, in order to make this balance absolute. Economically, yes. Technologically, yes. But it is not possible because of sanctions. It is not possible in the observable future, and thus technological decoupling from the West is the immediate priority for Russia. As for ideological inspiration, look. The Western societies and countries today, in the United States in particular, are in deep political crisis. And many people in Russia describe that as not just a political crisis, but also civilizational crisis in the West. And the domestic processes which we observe are not attractive to the Russian society. So those problems, polarization, the deep societal division, where in the United States you basically have two societies very different from one another and sharing different values and so on and so forth. The attempts to revise history and so on and so forth. Those issues, they drastically diminish the attractiveness of the West as idea for the Russian society. And I'm not talking just about Putin or the Russian government. I'm talking about the much wider circles and stratas of the Russian society.
I can just add one point on that. I think you mentioned something really importantly, that the West is both an ideology or a political order around liberalism and a kind of geographical and geopolitical structure. And I think the Russian perception is that the West as a liberal script or option is also closing for the West itself, right? And what is emerging is a non-liberal West or non-liberal Europe, but also globally non-liberal West, with whom Russia thinks it has a lot more to exchange because it's pushing for less interference. It's more on kind of respecting nation state and red lines. So the Russian perspective is also that, well, the West and liberalism are now decoupling, and that will help Russia on the long run to develop relationship with the West that will be much more plural ideologically, and that will therefore, and also be more polarized and therefore busy with its own domestic issues. But this idea that liberalism is arriving to an end is something very strong in Russia that really explains that. And that's why they consider they can still continue to discuss with the West. It will just be a different West. It will be a non-liberal West, or a West where liberalism will just be one plurality among many other ideological elements, which will be more cooperative or more respecting Russia's red line.
Well, thank you all very much. This has been a very fascinating discussion. We've only begun to scratch the surface of all the issues that are in play in the bilateral relationship. We'll all, I'm sure, be closely following developments in Reykjavik this week and in the broader relationship. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to our audience for a terrific set of questions, and we'll look forward to our next event.
Thank you
very much.